In ancient Egypt, death was not always the worst punishment. Sometimes the greatest terror didn't come from swords or serpents, but from shame, a punishment that didn't just target the body, but unmade the very soul. Because in the land of pharaohs and gods, to be humiliated was to be stripped of everything sacred, your dignity, your memory, your path to eternity. This wasn't just a culture of discipline, it was a civilization of cosmic order. And when that order was disrupted, the price was more than pain. It was erasure. Imagine a man dragged through the marketplace by temple guards, his robes torn, his hair shaved, his face spat upon. A woman stripped naked under the blazing sun, forced to stand before jeering crowds. Another man, once a noble, now branded across the cheek with hot iron. His name struck from every scroll, his tomb sealed no longer with respect, but with silence. These were punishments designed not only to wound the body, but to scar the soul. Because in Egypt, your name, your image, your funeral, all these were more than customs, they were lifelines to the afterlife. Without them, you didn't just die, you disappeared. Before we go further into this dark chapter of history, consider subscribing to History Remains. Your support helps us bring more of these untold stories to light. So what happened when your dignity was taken, your face disfigured, your memory erased? What did it truly mean to be humiliated in a world where the afterlife was everything? To understand why humiliation was such a powerful punishment in ancient Egypt, you must first understand what it meant to live with honor and die with it. The Egyptians believed life was a test, a preparation for something far more important, the afterlife. And that next world wasn't granted to everyone. You had to earn it through ritual purity and reputation. At the center of this belief was Ma'at, the divine concept of truth, balance, and cosmic order. Everything in Egyptian society, laws, relationships, spiritual practices, existed to maintain Ma'at. To disrupt it was to invite chaos, not just upon yourself, but upon the world. The justice system reflected this belief. Priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were moral judges. Scribes documented every offense, and the Pharaoh, seen as a living god, was the enforcer of divine law. Every act of justice was also a spiritual correction, and sometimes correction came not in chains or death, but in disgrace. Because public image was not vanity, it was salvation. Your name had to be spoken after your death, your image carved in stone, your body preserved, blessed, and buried with care. To be humiliated, publicly shamed, erased from history, denied a proper burial, was to be cast out of Ma'at and into oblivion. This is why the punishments you'll hear today weren't just cruel, they were existential. To the Egyptians, honor was not just a reputation, it was your ticket to eternity. And when that was stripped from you, when you were denied mourning, denied memory, denied even the right to speak, you were condemned not just in this life, but in the next. Because what terrified them most wasn't the pain of punishment, it was the silence that followed. In ancient Egypt, what you wore wasn't just clothing, it was identity. Linen robes weren't mere garments, they were markers of rank, of dignity, of divine favor. Even in death, a body was carefully wrapped, adorned, and sealed, because nakedness was not purity, it was shame. So when someone was punished with public nudity, it wasn't just a display of power, it was a ritual humiliation meant to unmake the person completely. Picture a sun-scorched courtyard in Thebes. Crowds gather as temple guards drag a trembling woman into view. Her linen dress is torn from her body. She stumbles as dust clings to her skin. She tries to cover herself, but her hands are tied. Children point. Elders turn away, not out of pity, but judgment. This wasn't uncommon. Women accused of adultery, blasphemy, or defiance could be stripped naked and paraded before the people. Men, too, especially those of lower status, were dragged half-naked through the streets for stealing, for lying, for offending the gods. To be exposed in this way was to be rendered less than human. And in Egypt, where every ritual emphasized the sanctity of form, being stripped bare meant being cast out of Ma'at itself. Religious texts and judicial records mention such punishments by name. One record from the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses describes a woman accused of ritual impurity. She was brought forth in the light of Ra without cover, so that all may know her sin.
Even temple rituals reinforced the symbolism. While high priests bathed in sacred pools and wore white garments to symbolize purity, the disgraced were denied even a shred of cloth, visibly marked as impure, unclean, and cursed. But there was more at play here. Nakedness was not only meant to degrade, it was meant to isolate. The punished could not return to family, to temple, to society. They were seen, but no longer recognized. And sometimes that was only the beginning, because for those who posed a greater threat, not just to law, but to legacy,
the punishment did not end with the body. Their very names would vanish. In ancient Egypt, immortality was earned not through deeds alone, but through remembrance. Your name had to be carved into tomb walls, your face sculpted in stone, your story passed on in prayers so that your soul could navigate the underworld and reach the field of reeds, the eternal paradise. So imagine the horror of having all of it undone. The punishment of damnatio memoriae, the deliberate erasure of one's name, face, and memory, was the ultimate sentence. It was a second death, one that echoed louder than the first. We see its legacy in broken statues and defaced walls, chisel marks where names once were, faces deliberately scratched away until the stone no longer resembled a person. The most famous victim was Pharaoh Akhenaten, who dared to defy tradition by worshipping one god, Aten, instead of the powerful Amun-Ra. After his death, priests and rulers alike turned on him. His temples were destroyed, his name scraped from monuments, his statues shattered and buried. To erase him was to unmake his soul. Even Queen Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful rulers, faced this posthumous humiliation. Her images were removed, her titles reassigned, her name nearly lost to time. Only fragments remained, enough for modern archaeologists to resurrect her story. But this punishment wasn't reserved for royalty. Commoners could face the same fate. A disgraced scribe, a temple traitor, or a condemned criminal might be erased from their family tombs, their children forbidden from speaking their name, their grave goods destroyed, their sarcophagus left empty. Because to the Egyptians, the soul was fragile. It needed three things to survive death: a name, a body, and remembrance. Without a name, you could not be summoned. Without a face, you could not be recognized by the gods. Without memory, you ceased to exist. It was psychological annihilation, not just for the punished, but for their families. It turned ancestors into strangers, lineages into voids. And while some were destroyed after death, others were forced to carry their shame alive, scarred, branded, and reshaped by pain. Because the next punishment was not erasure, it was disfigurement, a face turned into a sentence. In a culture where beauty, symmetry, and divine form was sacred, the human face was more than flesh, it was spiritual currency. The face you wore in life was the face you would carry into eternity. To alter it violently was to curse the soul itself. That's what made facial mutilation one of the most feared and humiliating punishments in ancient Egypt. Criminals convicted of blasphemy, adultery, theft, or treason were sometimes sentenced not to death, but to be marked forever. A scar across the cheek, a nose removed, a searing brand pressed into the skin. It was a punishment you could never hide. Imagine a man kneeling before a tribunal of priests. He's bound, trembling. A heated iron rod glows in the fire. When pressed to his face, it sizzles against skin. His scream echoes through the temple walls. But the punishment has only just begun, because that burn is more than physical. It's a symbol, a message carved into his identity. Ancient medical papyri, including the famed Ebers papyrus, reference treatments for facial wounds, but they also describe these punishments as divine correction. One line reads, "Let the shame dwell upon his skin, as his sin does upon his heart." The removal of the nose, a particularly brutal sentence, was often reserved for women accused of seducing temple priests or defiling sacred places. In Egyptian art, the nose was a vital symbol of life, the breath of the gods. To lose it was to sever that connection. A mutilated nose meant no recognition in the afterlife, no passage through the gates of judgment. Branding was used for repeat offenders and slaves. A branded mark on the cheek or forehead turned the person into a walking warning. Not only were they excluded from burial temples, but their descendants often bore the same shame. Marriage forbidden, names denied, bloodlines soiled. What made it truly cruel was that these punishments were designed to follow you, not just through life, but into death. A disfigured face was less likely to be painted on a coffin or carved into a funerary statue. Without that image, your soul might be lost forever. It was a living death, a body still breathing, but already damned. But for some, even that was a mercy, because the next punishment offered no burial at all. Not a mark, not a tomb, just abandonment. In Egypt, death was not the end, it was the beginning of a sacred journey. Every soul needed guidance, protection, and ritual. The body was to be mummified with care, organs placed in canopic jars, prayers whispered by priests, amulets wrapped tight to guard against the dangers of the underworld. To be denied this was not just cruelty, it was spiritual exile. For the most disgraced, grave robbers, temple violators, traitors, no burial rites were given, no tomb, no sarcophagus, no name carved into limestone. They were left as refuse, corpses thrown into pits, dumped in dry riverbeds, or left unguarded at the desert's edge where jackals roamed.
And the consequences were far more than physical decay. Egyptians believed the soul had many parts: the ka, the ba, the ak, and all of them depended on a well-prepared burial to survive. Without it, the ka would starve, the ba would wander, and the ak would never rise. The soul would be trapped, restless, alone. This punishment didn't just target the individual, it destroyed the entire legacy. Families were forbidden from mourning, sons couldn't retrieve the body, daughters couldn't speak their name. To grieve for the disgraced was to risk being cursed yourself. There are records like the Decree of Horemheb, a 14th century BCE text that detail the enforcement of such punishments. One decree reads, "Let the body of the defiler not be brought to rest, let his name be unsaid, let his flesh be for the birds." Some were denied mummification as a warning, others as revenge, still others because their crimes had upset the balance of Ma'at so deeply that the gods demanded they be forgotten entirely. And perhaps most horrifying, in some cases the living knew this would be their fate. They lived with the knowledge that no one would mourn them, that their soul would rot along with their body, that death, when it came, would not bring peace, but oblivion. Even their ghosts would be ignored. But there was one final cruelty, one last humiliation, not of the body, but of the voice. Because in Egypt, even your ability to speak could be taken. Imagine being punished so completely that even your voice is taken, not by injury, but by law, by ritual, by shame. In the final tier of humiliation, some Egyptians were sentenced to punishment both subtle and devastating: forced silence. The condemned were not allowed to speak in public again. No defense, no prayer, no cries of pain. Their mouths were to remain closed, sometimes literally. Ash, linen wrappings, or sacred oil was applied to the lips, symbolizing that their words had become impure. In a culture where speech was sacred, used in incantations, rituals, and offerings, this was a spiritual gag. Those silenced in this way became shadows. They walked among the living, but could not be heard. Eyes down, mouths hidden, hands bound in prayer they could no longer voice. They were alive, but not truly part of society anymore. This punishment was often reserved for temple priests who had broken sacred oaths, or those who had revealed forbidden knowledge, such as the names of gods not to be spoken. The sentence wasn't physical torment, it was isolation, alienation, and imposed invisibility. Religious scrolls speak of the vow of stillness. One passage describes a priest stripped of his robes, his tongue bound in symbolic ritual, and led silently through the city where even the people were forbidden to acknowledge him. There was a terrifying symbolism behind this silence. In Egyptian belief, the soul must be able to confess its innocence before the gods in the hall of judgment. The heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, and the soul had to say, "I have not lied, I have not stolen, I have not dishonored the sacred."
But if you had been silenced in life, how could you speak in death? This final humiliation ensured that your soul would not be heard in the afterlife, that you would pass through the do-it not with guidance, but with voicelessness, that even your suffering would vanish unwitnessed, unspoken, because to be silenced in Egypt was to become what they feared most. A soul without form, a life without memory, a death without noise. The ancient Egyptians built monuments that touched the sky. They inscribed prayers into stone and sealed tombs with magic. Yet their most lasting punishments were not inflicted with weapons, but with shame. To be stripped naked, branded, erased, silenced, or left unburied was to be condemned to a fate far worse than death. These were not momentary sentences, they were eternal judgments designed to outlive the flesh, to echo through time, and to sever the soul from its rightful place in the cosmos. In a world where life was only the beginning, humiliation was the great eraser, the punishment that didn't just end a person, but undid them. We often think of justice as swift and brutal in the ancient world, but in Egypt it was far more calculated. It wasn't about how you died, it was about how you were remembered, or whether you were remembered at all. Because in the end, the most terrifying punishment was not pain, it was being forgotten. Which of these humiliations do you think was the most horrifying, and why? Let us know in the comments below.